This interview is being conducted for St John, Scotland, 75 years of making a difference. My name is Dr. Sue Morrison and the respondent is Ian Wallace. This is April 2021 and the interview is taking place in Linlithgow. Thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed, Ian.
It's a pleasure.
For the record, would you please confirm your name?
My full name is Ian William John Wallace.
And what is your year or your year of birth?
1940.
Where were you brought up, Ian?
I was brought up on the west coast of Scotland, although I was born in Malta, but we moved to Scotland when I was 5 years old and have lived in Scotland either on the west coast or in Edinburgh and its environs ever since.
Thank you very much.
Despite the way I talk.
Would you please tell me a little about your family background?
Yes, well, it depends how far back you want to go. My father was in the Royal Navy, a professional sailor. He was at Dartmouth in the period immediately before the First World War. He went to sea in 1916 as a midshipman and was at the Battle of Jutland. My mother's father was in the army, fought in the trenches in the First World War, where he was highly decorated. He had an army career and ended up as a Major General. He was stationed in Malta in 1938-39, and it was there that my mother, his daughter, and my father, who was stationed in Malta as a naval officer, met and got married in 1939.
Could you tell me what your family did when you came to Scotland?
My father was posted to a naval shore station at what had before the war been Butlins holiday camp, and was taken over by the Navy during the war, and his job at the end of the war was to help decommission the camp and return it to civilian use. So we lived very near Butlins for about a year, and then at that point my father, who was then 46, 47, retired from the Navy, and we went to live in Ayr itself. I lived in Ayr until I went to university.
Would you tell me a bit about your career, please?
Yes, my undergraduate career was as a medical student in Edinburgh Medical School. I did the medical course plus a science degree, and then after I qualified, I did house jobs in surgery, medicine and obstetrics in various Edinburgh hospitals. Then I joined the Edinburgh Surgical Training Scheme, which consisted of 3 years of training in 6 different specialties. In those days you had to have a pretty wide range of experience, and then I joined the Department of Clinical Surgery at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary as a research fellow, and did research and at the same time carried on clinical work, and then graduated to being a lecturer in the department until with the equivalent status of a senior registrar in the NHS. And in 1976 I was appointed consultant general surgeon with a special interest in urology, or as I tell people, the plumbing, at Bangor General Hospital, which is about 12 miles out of Edinburgh. And in 1988-89 we moved into the newly built St John's Hospital in Livingston, where I continued as a consultant surgeon, and in the latter years also as firstly clinical director of surgery and then medical director, until I retired in 2002. I then returned half-time for a year because no arrangements had been made to replace me, by the Health Board and fully retired in 2003. And then since then I've obviously not done much clinical practice, but a lot of teaching in anatomy and basic surgical skills, both in Edinburgh and in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Could you tell me how you first became involved with St John's Scotland?
Between 1976 and 82, when we moved to Linlithgow, which is where I live now, we lived in Torfichan. And Torfichan, of course, has a very strong connection with the Order of St John through the preceptory, although at that time I wasn't really aware of the order. But when we moved from Bangor Hospital to St John's Hospital, the minister of Torfichan Kirk, Tom Crichton, who was very much involved with the Order of St John, came to St John's Hospital as the hospital chaplain, and I got to know him very well, and he interested me in the order, particularly because, having been born in Malta, I became suddenly aware of a kind of rather personal connection. And I was just looking up in the yearbook. I was actually admitted to the order as a member. I think by then we'd stopped calling them serving brothers in 1992, and then, much to my surprise, at various stages since then, I have been promoted to my present status.
Which is?
Knight of the Order. And also, thanks to our current prior, I'm also honoured to be called the Preceptor of Torfichan.
Before we delve further into your own experiences, would you be able to give me a kind of brief history of St John, Scotland?
There's no such thing as a brief history when it comes to the Order of St John, because it's extremely complex. But essentially, with the Reformation and the departure of Mary Queen of Scots from Scotland, all Catholic monastic orders were essentially expelled or dismantled. And of course the Order of St John, as it existed from medieval times, was a Catholic monastic order. And so it disappeared from Scotland and England. But in the early 19th century, the 1800s, there was a sort of upsurge of enthusiasm for what I like to think of as being romantic medievalism. And I think that was fed by Walter Scott's novels, Tennyson's poetry, the pre-Raphaelite painters, the development of the Anglo-Catholic movement in the Anglican Church. And this was associated with a great interest in the Holy Land, not as just a place to visit, but somewhere where you should be involved at a spiritual level, and also somewhere where there was an opportunity to put into practice some of the Christian virtues. And a group of individuals in England were very keen to see the Order of St John reconstituted in Britain. But unfortunately, of course, the huge stumbling block to that was that it wouldn't be Catholic. However, that didn't stop that group from building a hospital in Jerusalem for the treatment of eye diseases, which were very, very common at that time. And in the 1880s, that work was recognised by Queen Victoria, who, I wouldn't like to say legitimised, but established that this was not just a charitable group, but had special status. And she created the Venerable Order of the Hospital of St John of Jerusalem, which is a British order of chivalry. And that, of course, lent huge authority to the order. And at that time, the British Empire was at its peak. So very quickly, the Venerable Order spread to all the various parts of the empire and subsequently to the Commonwealth. So we now have priories in England, Scotland, Wales, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and other places, and other aspects of the organisation which are not actual priories but do the same sort of work, for instance in Malawi and so forth. So this is a worldwide organisation, very much founded on Christian philosophy, which is essentially simply in terms of our relationship with our neighbours, loving our neighbours as ourselves and serving them, which was the central ethos of the original Order of St. John, founded in 1098 in Jerusalem. I think that's about as potted a history as I can give.
St. John Scotland was founded in 1947?
Yes.
Could you tell me how that came about and what kind of links you had with St. Andrews?
Right, well, when the Venerable Order of the Hospital was founded by Queen Victoria, it extended over the whole of the United Kingdom. And obviously most of its work and the majority of its membership were in England, but there was an increasing enthusiasm in Scotland as well. And in 1947, there was a sufficient body of St. John activity in Scotland to justify setting up a separate priory. So until that time, we'd been part of St. John England, and then we became St. John Scotland as a separate but entirely integrated part of the worldwide Order of St. John. And that relationship that change meant that we were now equal partners with all the other priories throughout the world. And in fact, if you look at, particularly in recent years, the extent to which Scotland has contributed to the worldwide order in terms of, for instance, our previous prior, Sir Malcolm Ross, ultimately became Lord Prior of the whole worldwide order. So we've had a great deal of influence, and it's always been said that St. John Scotland manages to punch well above its weight, and I think that's a very reasonable account. On the other hand, Malcolm Ross always used to say we're also one of the best kept secrets in Scotland, which I think is a great pity. And to some extent, I think that is thought by some people to be because of our religious connection. Although, I mean, we're not a monastic order in any sense, but there is a general anxiety among many people to get involved with organisations which are too overtly religious nowadays, which I think is very sad, because in fact what we do is not dependent on our personal religious faith. It flows from it for many of us, but for many of our members throughout the world, they have no religious affiliation, but they are dedicated to the work of the order. I'm not sure whether that answers your question or not.
Could you just tell me a bit more about the agreement with St. Andrews?
Right. One of the founding elements of the Venerable Order, that's Queen Victoria's order, was the setting up of the St. Andrew's Ambulance. And again, that actually, with the founding of the hospital in Jerusalem, preceded the establishment of the order as an order of chivalry. Now in Scotland, and at that time, of course, there was no national ambulance service in Britain. If you got run over by a horse and cart, you were totally dependent on what facilities were provided in your particular town or city or wherever it was by either the local council or maybe another charitable organisation. And such an organisation had already existed in Scotland, the St Andrews Ambulance Association. Of course, both throughout the United Kingdom, when the National Health Service was founded in 1947, the ambulance service was seen as an integral part of the National Health Service, and this was set up independently of the pre-existing or St John Ambulance and St Andrews Ambulance. In Scotland, therefore, the relationship between the Order of St John and St Andrews was that we came later to the scene in terms. Now, the ambulance service did two things. It provided emergency care and transport, but it also provided training in how to treat the acutely ill, or particularly the acutely injured. And I can remember as a young doctor being a trainer for St Andrews Ambulance and going along on Saturday afternoons to run first aid classes. And the biggest group of people in Scotland who, of course, trained in first aid were in the mining industry. And we used to have these fabulous first aid competitions very often on a Saturday morning, and the winners were always the teams from the various pits, Bilston Glen and so forth. And like all competitions, it became a bit mechanical. So we'd have these actors playing the injured, and the first aider would come up, shake them, say, hello, hello, I am a qualified first aider, can you hear me? And that was the sort of, that earned a tick in a box on the score sheet, and the more ticks you got in the box, the more likely you were to win that competition. So it got a bit mechanical, but I have no sense of letting anybody down by teaching for St Andrews, because I didn't even know St John existed at that time. And so we've had to steer clear of first aid training and so forth. But now we are beginning to get into training for acute care of people who suffer from cardiac arrest, which is, of course, a consequence usually of a myocardial infarction. And that we are not seen as in any way treading on St Andrew's toes by doing.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring you now to your own career with St John in Scotland. Could you tell me, walk me through your early roles?
Well, as I say, I became a member, I think at the instigation of Tom Crichton, the minister from Tuffichan, in 1992, and I was just looking in the yearbook recently to check on dates, and the sequence of promotions is from member to officer. Now, I became chairman of the West Lothian branch of St John Scotland, as it is now known. It wasn't, the terminology has changed a bit in recent years, in about 95, 96, I think, and at that time I was promoted to officer, and subsequently, and I was then invited to join the managing board of St John Scotland, which was then called Chapter, a very monastic term, and was on Chapter as what was known, I think, as the representative officer from the grade. And after a while, I got a letter saying I'd been promoted to commander, which surprised me somewhat. However, that was fine. And then, having been on Chapter for a number of years, one of my fellow Chapter members was, of course, the then Hospitaller, Dr. John Calvert, who was a general practitioner down in Stranraer. And on his death, again, much to my surprise, I was asked if I would take over the role of Hospitaller. And after I'd done that for a spell, I was promoted to Knight of the Order. And so I was very lucky in that And I don't know if you've ever heard of something called Imposter Syndrome, but I think many of us have this feeling that, how on earth did I get here? I'm sure there are some people who think, I'm in the right place, I jolly well ought to be here, but most of us, I think, are slightly surprised to find ourselves in a particular state. I certainly was. But one of the great joys of being hospitaller was, of course, that I was expected and did go to visit the Eye Hospital in Jerusalem on a number of occasions, and was also involved in making some quite important financial decisions from Scotland, particularly one I'm very proud of on behalf of the Scottish Priory is the funding we were able to give for quite a big outreach building for the Eye Hospital in the town of Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem, where there's a day clinic, but at which things like cataract surgery and laser surgery for eye disease and so forth are carried on. And Scotland was a major contributor to the funding of that building. And the current prior, Mark Strudwick, and I and others were there at the opening of that building, which was a really great pleasure to be involved in.
What kind of people are treated at the eye hospital?
Its patient population is pretty much exclusively from the Palestinian community, who of course are not cared for within the Israeli community, and the Israeli hospitals are excellent, really good, but the eye hospital therefore has continued this tradition of treating eye diseases. And it's not just the hospital, which is in East Jerusalem, but there is the day hospital I've already mentioned in Hebron. There's a really big hospital branch in Gaza, which of course is a very, very hazardous place to be trying to deliver care, and then various outreach clinics and clinics throughout the whole of the West Bank. So it's a very extensive service which is provided. And the reason it's eye disease is, when the original hospital was founded back in the 1880s, the main eye disease was probably infective trachoma, which is common in hot countries. Now the majority of eye disease is either diabetic, and diabetes is very common in the Palestinian population, cataract, common in all aging populations, congenital eye disease, that is inherited abnormalities, which reflects the very strong tendency in the Palestinian community for first cousin marriage. And that's a long tradition in communities like that. It's to do with being sure that your daughter marries somebody you know something about, but also that you keep property within the family, and that you don't contaminate the family's genetics with dubious outsiders. And that's quite common in many communities. But the problem with close consanguinity in marriage is you produce babies who can inherit all sorts of problems. I mean, it's quite interesting, in the Jewish community, a lot of these problems are neurological, but in Palestinians it seems to be particularly tends to affect the eyes, alterations in the shape of the eyes, congenital cataracts and so forth. And then of course the other big problem is trauma, which is rife unfortunately throughout the Holy Land from time to time, particularly in Gaza.
What were your first impressions of the eye hospital in Jerusalem?
I think the first thing, it's a very, very nice purpose-built building in a beautiful setting. The staff are some Muslim, some Christian, some native Palestinian. The majority now, virtually all of them, are Palestinian people who've been trained as nurses, as doctors, as administrators. but also with input from specialists from Europe who come and teach or carry out complex surgery. But the overwhelming feeling is that of a group of people of very disparate backgrounds who have one objective, which is delivering this superb service. And it is a superb service. It is recognised worldwide as a high standard ophthalmic hospital, up there with Moorfields in London, for instance. So it's a very highly recognised, and the staff understand that they are appreciated and valued, and that's very important. And to have been associated with that for a few years was an enormous privilege. And the people there are so friendly and welcoming. I can remember, although I'm not an eye surgeon myself, my specialty is quite different, just going into the theatre in scrubs and watching operations. And most eye operations nowadays you can watch on a television screen because they're all done with microscopes. And then sitting in the day room in the theatre, having breakfast with the staff, and just being made welcome. Great feeling.
Could you tell me about do you have any particular stories about the eye hospital?
Yes, well, probably one of the things I remember most, other than going into theatre, well, there's one related to theatre. That was this old lady had had a cataract operation, which of course is done under local anaesthesia. I think she was probably in her late 60s, something like that, which for that population is fairly old. And just her being wheeling out saying shukran, 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 which is the Arabic for thank you, as she was wheeled out of theatre. And this feeling that this lady's life had been changed. Because if you can't see in a community like that, you're terribly disadvantaged. And another is we had a big fundraising event. One time I was visiting, and we had the hospital is built around a beautiful courtyard, open courtyard, with bougainvilleas growing, lovely magentas and reds and orange flowers. Sitting there in the evening, having dinner in the twilight, and just everybody from all over, and these were people from all over the world who support the eye hospital, from America, from Australia, and other parts of the world, and just this sense of being part of this, I think the word is community, the worldwide community supporting this particular endeavour.
You mentioned fundraising a couple of times now. Could you tell me about some of the activities that you do to raise funds?
I mean, fundraising is the main function, one of the two main functions of the order throughout the world. And fundraising goes from everything from schmoozing wealthy people. I went to a dinner in London, which was held in Crosby Hall, which is a Elizabethan building in Chelsea, which itself has a most fascinating history. And it was attended, the guest of honour was the Queen of Jordan, who, of course, Jordan has a long connection with the Palestinian population of the West Bank. And the purpose of that was to get rich people who were our guests to dig deep into their pockets, which they did. And we had an excellent fundraising officer in the English Priory at that time, who we saw a lot of in Scotland as well. So at one end you'd have this, we're looking for thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands from wealthy people. And that is the main function of the American Priory. I didn't mention the American Priory, but there is a Priory of the Order of St. John in the United States of America. And because the Queen is the sovereign head of our order, they recognise the Queen as their sovereign head, although they live in the American Republic. And whether or not they sing the national anthem, I'm not quite sure. But their main purpose is fundraising for the hospital. And the Americans are very good at big bucks fundraising, and they're the major funders of the hospital. But at a local level, for instance, in West Lothian, we have garden parties and other fundraising activities. And we're very lucky because we have the preceptory, which members of St John act as custodians at the weekends for public visitors. We get anything that the public pay to get in and the money from anything we sell. And the preceptory generates probably about £2,000 to £3,000 a year, which in the context of the whole fundraising of St John is not very much. But nevertheless, I always say to visitors, if you buy a ticket here, you're helping us to continue to send money from Torfichen to the eye hospital, to a hospital in Jerusalem, and that's been going on for the last 800 years, because the preceptory was founded in 1111 or 1112, something like that, under King David, and the function of all these St John properties throughout Europe was to raise money to send back to Jerusalem, and we're still doing it.
Thank you. That brings me neatly on to Torfichen Preceptory.
Yeah.
Would you please tell me a bit about its history?
Again, I mean, very complex, but land within less than a century after the founding of the Order in Jerusalem, there were St John establishments all over Europe being supported through the church by various rulers and landowners and so forth. And I just saw the other day a map of the St John properties throughout Europe in the 13th century, and there were about 400 sites throughout Europe, of which the most northerly and almost furthest away from headquarters was Torfichen. And of course at that time St John, the Order of St John, the original hospitaller order, Scotland was of course going through the wars of independence, so the preceptory was founded under the auspices of King David I, but for quite a lot of the time Scotland was effectively being run by Edward I of England. However, the Scottish preceptory managed to weather all these storms, sometimes giving allegiance to the King of England and sometimes to the King of Scots, and persisted under the care of a series of preceptors until the time of the return of John Knox from Switzerland and the Scottish Reformation. And at that time, the last preceptor of Torfichen was in fact very much in favour of the Reformation, as many people throughout Europe were. I mean, the church at that time had really deteriorated into this sort of sink of iniquity, which is, I suppose, absolutely characterised by the Borgia popes. But the papacy was essentially a power base for wealthy Italian, or in the case of the Borgia, Spanish families, and its relationship to the true history of Christianity was non-existent. It was a self-seeking organisation. Now, there will be some people who will argue with that, and out of that came this desire to get back to something like the original principles of the Christian faith. And unfortunately, I would say most of the Reformation didn't do a terribly good job, because quite quickly the Reformed churches were taken over by people who saw it as a route to power. And that's always been the case. The worst thing that happened to Christianity was its recognition by Constantine the Great as the religion of the Roman Empire, because it then became a tool of the state. I regret to say. But on the other hand, it might not have survived, certainly not in the form it is now, had he not done so. But that's another story. When the order was expelled from Scotland, the last preceptor, who, as I said, was very supportive of the Reformation, actually left the order. He paid the crown a significant amount of money and bought the property, and with it came a title, Lord Torfichan, and his name was James Sandilands, and in fact the Sandilands family still own the preceptory and the house next to it. They live in Mid Calder or West Calder, and they're still Lord Torfichan. But now I can't tell you exactly when, but obviously the owning of a property like the preceptory, which is simply the residual part of the original church of the monastic building, would not be something which most families would want to have hanging around their neck. It would be a terrible millstone, and it is now under the care of Historic Scotland, or now Historic Environment Scotland, although it is still, I believe, the property of Lord Torfichan. And fortunately, he is a supporter of the order, and Historic Scotland recognise the order's connection with the preceptory, and I think are quite happy for us to provide custodial functions, because it means they don't have to pay anybody to do it, although they don't get any of the money that comes over the counter, as it were, when people come. But it's a relatively small amount, so it's not a big loss to their funds, I think. And so from certainly the for the second half of the 20th century, the preceptory has been seen as having this connection with St John in Scotland, and we open it to the public between Easter and the end of September, usually, every weekend, Saturday and Sunday. And okay, it's a source of funds, but it also is tremendously interesting, the number of people who come either knowing a bit about St John or thinking it's something to do with the Templars, who of course since, what's his name,
Dan Brown.
Yeah, Dan Brown, thank you. The Templars have really shot up in public interest. And of course, that's quite interesting in itself, because when the Templars were suppressed by the King of France in the 13th century, all the properties which were Templar properties in Scotland fell to St John in Scotland, the original Order of St John. So, for instance, there's a village called Temple in Midlothian, which was where the Templars, and they had properties all over Scotland, and those became were handed over to St John. So St John did very well out of the suppression of the Templars, and I won't even start on why that happened, because it's very complex. So since the founding of St John's Scotland in 1947, the preceptory has been seen as being a focal point for St John's Scotland. We have every year a service there. The main national event for St John's Scotland, which is held on or as near as possible to St John's Day, which is the 21st of June, is our annual festival, and that's held in a different church in Scotland each, like Perth Cathedral, a church in Glasgow, Inverness Cathedral, all different places. But we also have a St John service in Torfichan once a year, to which people come from all over Scotland, and that sort of recognises the very special place that the preceptory has in our history. And for me especially, it's a joy because, as I say, I've been connected with the preceptory, being a member of St John West Lothian since 1992 or so, therefore I was particularly touched when Mark Strudwick said, I think we should reinstate. The position of preceptor was part of the structure of the reinstated, or the Scottish Priory when it was set up in 47, but it's been held only intermittently, and I had the last preceptor, I think, left office in the 1990s, and so I was very touched when Mark said we must get the preceptor's post re-established, and asked me to do it. And I've always said it is an appointment without either responsibility or emolument. But it's a great privilege to be in that position.
What does your role involve there?
Sorry?
What does your role involve as preceptor?
Well, it's what I make of it, really. And to be honest, in terms of the relationship with the preceptory, I would say it hasn't changed much, in that I've always been involved with the manning of the preceptory, and I've helped to run the rota of people who do it. And I take groups of people round and tell them about the history and point out bits of the architecture and things like that. And I can tell you, if you do that any time between the end of September and the beginning of April, it's very cold. Because there's no heating in the building. But people like to come and hear about the history and have things pointed out to them which they mightn't actually see if you didn't actually. And if you look there, there's a mason's mark which must date from the 13th, 14th century. Or there's the remains of a gravestone which has been built into the wall. We can see how the present parish church is founded on the nave of the old preceptory church and things like that. And people are quite interested in that.
You mentioned that there are a wee team of people who help. What exactly is the role of volunteers at Torfechan?
It is to essentially admit the public, explain to them as much as they can what's going on, because it's quite difficult to have two people on duty at the same time. We don't do as much guiding as we would like to do, and we had it not been for the COVID problem, we were on the verge of setting up a relationship with the local branch of the Air Cadets to train them to be tour guides. And we also were about to embark on a project with the local primary school. And these things have, of course, had to go into cold storage. But I'm hoping that we will be able to reinstate these, because if we could have a group of people who were free to actually take visitors around the building and point things out to them, rather than just having to look at a book and say, look here, look there. And it's sometimes quite difficult to identify things just by a description of where they are in the book. And if you've got somebody who really knows what they're talking about, saying, now this is, for instance, there's a little alcove in the wall of the south transept, which is what's called a piscina, which is a washing basin for washing the vessels which were used at communion, which means that that bit of the church was obviously where Mass was said, probably on a daily basis. Many churches, Mass would be said at the high altar, perhaps on Sundays or on festivals, but on the daily Mass would be said in a side chapel. And of course, in many Catholic churches still, there are side chapels, and in medieval times, these were often paid for, certainly in bigger churches, by wealthy families, and they would have a priest there saying Mass all the time as a way of trying to buy their probably rather disreputable relative out of purgatory or hell. And there was this kind of magical idea that if you said Mass enough for somebody's soul, you earned them relief from purgatory. And that was one of the innumerable bizarre developments which I think led to the Reformation. And the medieval church was a very, very odd organisation. And I'm quite sure Jesus would have looked at it and say, what in heaven's name is going on here? Alas. Well, as I said, the primary objective of the order worldwide is funding the hospital, but in each priory there is also local charitable objectives, and for quite a long time St John's Scotland owned quite a number of properties which were used. For instance, there was a house in Edinburgh, in Cramond, which was used as a sort of should we say, a patient hotel or a relative hotel for patients who were coming from a long distance for treatment, particularly in the radiotherapy and oncology departments at the Western General Hospital. There was a similar property in Glasgow. We also have some sheltered housing in Falkirk. Now, and we had and these are mostly, the one in Falkirk was purpose-built, but a lot of the other properties were gifted to the order, left in wills. So, and we had a hospital, an actual hospital in Aberdeen for quite a long time, a private hospital where people went for medical and surgical treatment. It's like a nursing home. I mean, Edinburgh was full of private nursing homes up until certainly I was about 10 years postgraduate. I used to, as a junior doctor, to go as bag carrier to my consultant surgeon when he went to St Raphael's or the civil service nursing home to do surgery. And you could go into this, well, in the case of the civil service nursing home, it was had been the kitchen, which was kitted out as an operating theatre, and you brought the consultant's own bag of instruments with you. They were put in the steriliser by sister, sterilised, then the operation was done, not quite on the kitchen table, but I mean on a table in what was the kitchen. St Raphael's was a much more purpose-built nursing home with a good operating theatre. And that really only disappeared in the 1970s, that sort of private practice, when particularly the Murrayfield Hospital was built in Edinburgh, which is state of the art. And I think most people felt the risks involved in doing surgery in the basement of a building in Murray Place or somewhere like that, really, it was no longer acceptable. Because, of course, many of my senior consultants had worked before the NHS came into existence, and they were used to doing all their work. Their charitable work, as it were, was in the Royal Infirmary, and their paid work was in the nursing homes. And that has changed out of all recognition, of course. So anyway, I've definitely gone off piste there. Other charitable activities, as we've already said, we couldn't do first aid training because of our relationship with St Andrews, but an important development was not only patient hotels, but patient transport. So, for instance, John Calvert, who I referred to as my predecessor as Hospitaller, had set up a private patient transport service to take patients from the Stranraer, Dumfries area up to Glasgow for oncology treatment and for dialysis, because it's a long trek from Stranraer to Glasgow, and this was all done by volunteer drivers. And they also set up, I think, funded a room in Dumfries Infirmary for relatives, which is, facilities for relatives in hospitals are not always very good, and those sort of things. And then gradually we moved more and more into patient transport, and then the most recent initiative has been the funding of defibrillators anywhere that wants them, pretty much. A relationship with the Scottish, I can't remember exactly what he calls it, but the Scottish golfing community to provide defibrillators at golf courses, because of course the users of golf courses include a lot of people who might well drop dead on the 13th green. The only trouble is if the defibrillator's back at the clubhouse, a bit of a rush to get. So, but defibrillators are very important, because the thing that kills people who have heart attacks in the first instance is very often what's called ventricular fibrillation, where the heart starts beating totally irregularly. And if you can control that long enough to get them, that combined with CPR, cardiac massage, to get them into an ambulance and to hospital, they can be brought back. And that has really had a major impact on the mortality from acute myocardial infarction, which is great. If you get somebody to a hospital where they can do angiography and stenting and things, as when I was a house physician, if somebody came in with a heart attack, all you could do was give them drugs to keep their blood pressure up, and there was very little else. There was no surgical intervention, and most of them died. So we're helping to, as it were, bring people back from the brink for long enough to get them into specialist care. And I would say that's probably been one of the most valuable recent introductions to the work of St John. And the great thing is it also involves people in doing things. And that's linked to the first responder system to some extent as well.
There are other initiatives and activities within St John. Do you know anything about the Mountain Rescue Service?
Well, yes. To the best of my knowledge, our relationship with the Mountain Rescue Service really was developed under the leadership of our last but two priors, Sir James Stirling, who had a connection with Gordonston School. And one of the activities which Gordonston ran was a local mountain rescue service in that part of Scotland. And the Mountain Rescue Service in Scotland is very interesting because it's entirely voluntary, and it is delivered by tremendous enthusiasts, often under very difficult conditions. And so what Sir James did was encourage St John Scotland to take on two things. Firstly, the provision of mountain rescue headquarters for all the different areas, so mountain rescue buildings where equipment was stored and so forth, and also the provision of all-terrain vehicles. And over the time that I've been associated with the order, we have funded the building, I think, of about 12 mountain rescue centres, and each of those was supplied with Land Rover type vehicles, and where the necessity arose, eventually replacement vehicles. I think we funded a few rescue dogs, which are very important to finding people, and more recently we've also funded mountain rescue trainer who works with the Mountain Rescue Service but also in mountaineering clubs to train people in mountain safety. One of the biggest problems in mountain rescue is people who wander up onto the mountains or the hills totally unprepared, unequipped. The fog comes down or the snow starts to fall. It's unbelievable how, yes, stupid is the only word you can say some people are, or how ignorant they are of the risks of going onto the hills and mountains in Scotland, where there can be a beautiful sunny day, or we'll walk up Ben so-and-so, and then the weather changes, and they are not properly dressed, they get hypothermic, they trip and fall, there are big areas where there isn't phone coverage, etc., etc. So a lot of mountain rescue work is generated by people who are just being silly, unfortunately, but they still turn out. And I may say we get very little credit for that. in terms of national coverage.
St John, Scotland is also involved with Malawi?
Yes, we have a particular connection with southern Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and of course Malawi, there is a long connection between Scotland and Malawi through originally Dr. Livingstone and, Livingstone the explorer, Dr. Livingstone I presume, etc. And we have there is a St John association in Malawi, and through that we fund particularly two things: a mother and baby service, but also increasingly AIDS support and care, because AIDS is still a major problem in sub-Saharan Africa, partly because they can't afford the drugs which now have made AIDS an insignificant disease in the civilized West, but also because there are parts of southern Africa where it's still not admitted that it exists. And so it's a huge scourge in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're helping to support the care of AIDS victims as well.
What would you say have been the biggest challenges for St John Scotland since your involvement?
I would say the biggest challenges are public recognition and recruitment. And this is an issue which besets almost every charitable organisation you can think of, which is manpower heavy. Charities which essentially are simply fundraisers, which then can channel their funds into a delivery organisation. So people, cancer relief, Marie Curie, things like that. They are very well established to deliver very specific purposes. But I'm also a member of Rotary, and we expect, Rotary has a worldwide tradition of raising funds for enormous, but it is beset, certainly in Britain and I think even in North America, with the problem of recruitment of new members. The membership of so many charitable organisations is an ageing membership, and for some reason, some people, fewer and fewer people seem to want to get involved. Now, in a town like Linlithgow, we have 2 Rotary clubs, we have Round Table, we have the rugby club is a major charitable organisation, supporting organisation as well as supporting rugby, etc., etc. But so many organisations are somehow just seen as being maybe they're too demanding, or maybe people have got a bit more selfish than they used to be. There's a less of tradition of service, and yet COVID has brought out in our society an absolute wealth of caring and support. So it's there. I think the other thing is that most people who retire at, say, the age of 60 can expect to live for another 20 years. And for most of that time, the majority of them will be fit and healthy, and they would bring a wealth of experience and ability to any organisation they got involved in. And it's just hooking them and pulling them in. And how do you get, what is the way to enthuse people, rather than them saying, I don't want to be bothered with that, I just want to play golf. And it's the biggest challenge of our society, is getting new members to many charitable organisations.
Would you say there are other challenges?
I think there are some, particularly in organisations like ours, where increasingly we're actually interacting with members of the public, because people are, for instance, in the context of first responders or Heart Start and things like that, people are frightened that if they intervene and it doesn't work, they may in some way be held responsible. this whole medico-legal or legal thing is, and now you see you can't almost do anything which involves contact with large parts of the public, particularly the young and the elderly, without having to have a what's generally known as a police check. And many people feel, I've been a respectable member of society for 60 years and all of a sudden I have to be checked out by the police before I do. And you can understand why that should be, but in fact, if you look at the genesis of this, the number of occasions on which people have misbehaved is tiny, and yet they have muddied the waters for a whole swathe of society who would like to be helpful but don't feel they want to have that degree of intrusion into their lives. I think that's a great tragedy.
What would you say have been the biggest achievements of St John's Scotland over the last... Well, what have been in Scotland?
Well, I think it was a great achievement that St John Scotland was established in the first instance. I think that over the time that I've been involved, I've seen a major review of how the organisation works, and I would attribute that primarily to the enthusiasm of our previous prior, Sir Malcolm Ross, who really steered us through a major organisational review process, which involved a lot of consultation at various levels through the order, and that process has been consolidated and brought into focus by our present prior, Mark Strudwick. And I think that has actually, it doesn't sound very sexy, that sort of thing, but it's absolutely fundamental to an organisation functioning well, is that it looks at the context within which it does what it does and changes the way it does it in order to become more effective. And I think I said Tom Crichton was my kind of, if you like, my godfather in the organisation. And I asked him once, when I was very junior and I saw all these, if you look at a list of the people at the top of the organisation over the years, there are some very, very prestigious names in there, particularly at the top levels. And I said, how do people, how do we appoint our senior people? He said, it's a self-perpetuating oligarchy. And he was absolutely right. And I think we have become much more democratic as an organisation. Before it was top-down, the guys at the top said what was to happen and people did it. Now we are dependent on people throughout the organisation coming up with ideas and saying, let's think about how we can deliver this or deliver that. And I think that's a tremendously healthy thing. So that's not perhaps the sort of achievement you might have been thinking of when you asked Chris, but I think without that, we would not be where we are now, which is an organisation which has gone from being a fundraising organisation, which largely gave money to other charities or sent it outside the country, to one which is actually delivering hands-on care, defibrillation, patient transport, these sort of activities.
How do you see St John's Scotland moving forward?
I think that's always the most important question for any organisation which wants to grow and develop. And I think we've established a platform now in terms of our structure, our management, and the way our members are treated, which gives it the potential for going forward into the future as a really worthwhile organisation. If we still have a problem, it is with recruitment. And as seen from the outside, although I don't think it's actually true, that the sort of public face of St John is still that it's a rather exclusive sort of organisation, which it isn't. But if you have an organisation where the people at the top are the Lord Lion, King of Arms, and General so and so, and the Jones of Jonestown, and the Marquis of this and all the rest. That's quite daunting for the man in the street. And yet, of course, these are just people like the rest of us, and they're there because they want to make the thing work. And we have to draw our talents and our abilities from every level in society. But we've got to go out and sell, and I still don't think we're very good at selling. And if we need more talent in any area, it's, I think, in our national publicity. Somehow, the best word I think one can use is we've got to make ourselves more sexy to the population, so that people say, that's what I'd like to do. They don't want to be mountain rescuers and things like that, but just to be able to see somebody fall down in the street and be able to bring them back to life. If you speak to somebody who's had that experience, it is life-changing to save somebody's life. Absolutely life-changing. And somehow you've got to get that enthusiasm out there.
How many volunteers would you say that St John Scotland has currently?
I have no idea. All I can say is I suspect it's a much bigger number than most of us think it is. I mean, I can tell you from looking at a yearbook how many members we have, and the majority of those members will be doing something. But there are quite a lot of people who are not members of the order, who are supporters and who help to make it work. And the way... This was something we wrestled with for quite a long time. Most organisations, you join the organisation. You can't join St John. You have to be invited to join, and the only person who can actually give you that invitation is the Queen. Obviously, she's told, she's given the list, as it were, but and so that sort of may be seen by some people as being a bit off-putting. And yet, of course, if it happens, it's an amazing feeling, and it's getting, maybe in Scotland too, where there's a fairly strong anti-establishment, anti-monarchist tradition, it's a little more difficult to sell, maybe.
What would you say to all the volunteers who do help St John Scotland on quite a regular basis? How would you rate their contribution?
I would say St John could not exist without you. Everything you do, whether it's exciting and sexy, like saving somebody's life, or whether it's rattling a can, or whether it's running a coffee morning, or whatever, everything you do is contributing to the work of the order. And if you raise £5 by rattling a can, and that money goes to the eye hospital, it will buy a cataract operation for somebody, and you'll save that person's sight. I think that's one of the great tragedies, as well as one of the triumphs of our society now, is everybody thinks everything comes for nothing, particularly when it comes to healthcare. I think we grossly underestimate how difficult it is and how expensive it is to ensure that, in normal times anyway, you make an appointment with your doctor, the doctor sorts things out, or says, "I think you ought to see so and so, organise that." See the consultant in his office or whatever it is, and or in the consulting room in the hospital, and he says, "No, it's nothing to worry about," or "We'll get this done, that done," or "I'm afraid you need an operation," and it happens, and the whole thing is just taken for granted. And maybe actually one of the long-term benefits of the COVID epidemic will be that people don't take things quite so much for granted. That they don't take being alive and remaining alive so much for granted. I mean, we've had, I can't remember what the number is, but now we're coming up for something like 200,000 deaths from this one disease. And that we haven't had more, and that people have survived, has been because of our health service. And everybody thinks it's just there. And so it is, and thank God that it is there. But maybe we take it a bit too much for granted. And so I think this kind of, and I know this is the moan of people of my generation, I think we've moved into a culture of rights but not responsibilities. And there are very few, we talk about human rights. There are only two human rights, or one really, that having been born, sooner or later you'll die. Everything else is a social construct. And yet we kind of assume that we have all these rights. But the only reason we have them is because somebody has fought for them, and we have a responsibility to make sure that those rights are protected, and that we take the responsibility for managing society so that those rights can be expected. That's very philosophical, and I don't want to say any more about it.
What are your hopes for the future of St John's, Scotland?
That it continues to grow and develop and do the things it's meant to do, and that its function and its work is more widely recognised, because it's only if that happens that it will continue to grow and do its work.
Overall, how would you sum up your own experience of being involved with St John's, Scotland?
I've been extraordinarily lucky. I have done, ever since I left school, the thing I most wanted to do. I knew probably from the age of about 10 I wanted to be a doctor. I was lucky enough in terms of my intellect and my upbringing to be able to get to medical school and to have enough stickability to do it and go through it. And those are not things, those depend on your life experience. I was very lucky in my family upbringing and all the rest of it. And so my career, my professional career, has been, I can honestly say, I can't recall ever having a day when I didn't want to go to work. I can remember days when I came home thinking, thank God that's over. But as I say to people again and again, to do the job you enjoy more than anything else in the world and get paid for it is great good fortune. And then, although part of my St John time was before I retired, it has gone on since, and it's been a strand of my post-working life, along with Rotary and other things, which have gone on making life, and teaching particularly, teaching young doctors in various parts of the world, made my life extraordinarily interesting. I mean, still, there are a few days when I don't want to get out of bed. It takes a little longer than it used to, and I do like to have a cup of coffee and a read before I get up in the morning nowadays. But, I am so lucky, because I think so many people I know who are retired lead pretty uninspired sort of existences, and their golf handicap doesn't get any better, and whatever it is. And, what more could I ask?
Yeah, it's been an absolute delight, and I think that's all of my questions, but do you have anything that you would like to add?
I think I've said quite enough, quite enough. But actually, no, I'd like to. I don't know whether we're still recording or not, but now I'd like to say thank you, because I think it's very good to have an opportunity to explore oneself and one's experience of life in a way that you don't normally do from day to day. You know, just take everything, things happen and tick along. You just have to sit back for a bit and think about it. And interestingly enough, as a Christmas present from my son and daughter in America, I was given this year's subscription to an organisation where every couple of weeks you get asked a question and you write, and it's about yourself and your history and your views on life, everything from, you know, who was your first friend at school to what would you like to say about bringing up children, and you write a piece and you tack it onto the inviting email and send it back, and at the end of the whole process it's put into a book form for you. And so I've done a certain amount of, somebody once described as taking your innards out and inspecting them and putting them back again through that process, and this has been kind of complementary to it in relation specifically to St John, or mostly to St John, so I found it very interesting.
Thank you very much.